subcommittee will come to order. The subcommittee will return to consideration of the committee print relating to H.R. 627, the Credit Cardholders Bill of Rights Act of 2009. There are 3 postponed roll call votes pending before the subcommittee, which will be taken in the following order: the amendment offered by Mr. Ackerman, the amendment offered by Mr. Henserling, number 103, and the amendment offered by Mr. Henserling, numbered 104. The question is on the adoption of the amendment offered by Mr. Ackerman of New York. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Maloney.
Aye.
Mrs. Maloney votes aye. Mr. Watt. Mr. Ackerman. Mr. Ackerman votes aye. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kanjorski. Mr. Kanjorski votes aye. Ms. Waters. Mr. Hinojosa. Mrs. McCarthy. Mrs. McCarthy votes aye. Mr. Baca. Mr. Baca votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay votes aye. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Ms. Bean. Ms. Bean votes no. Mr. Hodes. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Klein. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster votes aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter votes aye. Ms. Spear. Mr. Childers. Mr. Childer votes no. Mr. Minnick. Mr. Minnick votes no. Mr. Henserling. Mr. Henserling votes no. Mr. Barrett. Mr. Barrett votes no. Mr. Castle. Mr. Castle votes no. Mr. King. Mr. King votes no. Mr. Royce. Mr. Jones. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito votes no. Mr. Garrett. Mr. Gerlach. Mr. Nagerbauer. Mr. Nagerbauer votes no. Mr. Price. Mr. Price votes no. Mr. McHenry. Mr. McHenry votes no. Mr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell votes no. Mr. McCarthy. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant votes no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee votes no. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Gutierrez. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
Is there anyone who hasn't voted? Please. Mr. Meeks?
I'm sorry, Mr. Meeks votes aye.
Who's next? Sherman?
Mr. Sherman votes aye.
Mr. Klein? Mr. Watt?
Wait a minute, I'm sorry. Mr. Klein votes aye.
Mr. Watt?
Mr. Watt votes aye.
Ms. Waters?
Ms. Waters votes aye.
And the chairman votes aye. All those, please. Mr. Royce?
Mr. Royce? Mr. Royce votes no.
Anybody else? Clerk, please report.
Mr. Chairman, on that, the ayes are 18 and the noes are 17.
The amendment is adopted. The amendment is agreed to. I'm sorry. The amendment is agreed to. The question is on the adoption of the amendment offered by Mr. Henserling of Texas, number 103. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Maloney?
No.
Mrs. Maloney votes no. Mr. Watt? No. Mr. Watt votes no. Mr. Ackerman? No. Mr. Ackerman votes no. Mr. Sherman? No. Mr. Sherman votes no. Mr. Moore? No. Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kanjorski? No. Mr. Kanjorski votes no. Ms. Waters? No. Ms. Waters votes no. Mr. Hinojosa? Mrs. McCarthy? No. Mrs. McCarthy votes no. Mr. Baca? No. Mr. Baca votes no. Mr. Green? Mr. Clay? No. Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Clay? No. Mr. Clay votes no. Mr. Miller? No. Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Scott? No. Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Cleaver? No. Mr. Cleaver votes no. Ms. Bean? No. Ms. Bean votes no. Mr. Hodes? Mr. Ellison? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Meeks? Mr. Meeks votes no. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster votes no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter votes no. Ms. Spear? Mr. Childers? Mr. Childers votes no. Mr. Menick? Mr. Menick votes no. Mr. Henserling? Mr. Henserling votes aye. Mr. Barrett? Mr. Barrett votes aye. Mr. Castle? Mr. Castle votes aye. Mr. King? Mr. King votes aye. Mr. Royce? Mr. Royce votes aye. Mr. Jones? Mrs. Capito? Mrs. Capito votes aye. Mr. Garrett? Mr. Garrett votes aye. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Gerlach votes aye. Mr. Nagerbauer? Mr. Nagerbauer votes aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price votes aye. Mr. McHenry? Mr. McHenry votes aye. Mr. Campbell? Mr. Campbell votes aye. Mr. McCarthy? Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant votes aye. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee votes aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Lance? Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Chairman? Chairman
No.
votes no.
Yes, Mr. Hodes?
Mr. Hodes votes no.
Anybody further wishing to vote? The clerk, please call the roll. Call the vote, please. Report it.
Mr. Chairman, on this roll call, the ayes are 15 and the noes are 24.
The amendment is not agreed. Yes, the gentleman from California asked if he was recorded.
He's recorded as an aye.
Good. And would you, clerk, would you give us the tally again, please?
Yes, sir, the ayes are 15 and the noes are 24.
All right. The amendment is not agreed to. The question is on the adoption of the amendment offered by Mr. Henseling of Texas, number 104. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Maloney? Mrs. Maloney votes no. Mr. Watt? No. Mr. Watt votes no. Mr. Ackerman? Mr. Ackerman votes no. Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman votes no. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kandorski? No. Mr. Kandorski votes no. Ms. Waters? No. Ms. Waters votes no. Mr. Hinojosa? Mrs. McCarthy? Mrs.
No.
McCarthy votes no. Mr. Baca?
Just a voice vote.
Mr. Baca votes no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Clay?
You want to do a voice vote?
Mr. Clay votes no. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Cleaver? Mr. Cleaver votes no. Ms. Bean? Ms. Bean votes no. Mr. Hodes? Mr. Hodes votes no. Mr. Ellison? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Meeks? Mr. Meeks votes no. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster votes no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter votes no. Ms. Spear? Mr. Childers? Mr. Childers votes no. Mr. Menick? Mr. Menick votes no. Mr. Henserling? Mr. Henserling? Mr. Henserling votes yes. Mr. Barrett? Mr. Barrett votes aye. Mr. Castle? Mr. Castle votes aye. Mr. King? Mr. King votes aye. Mr. Royce? Mr. Royce votes aye. Mr. Jones? Mrs. Capito? Mrs. Capito votes aye. Mr. Garrett? Mr. Garrett votes aye. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Gerlach votes aye. Mr. Nagerbauer? Mr. Nagerbauer votes aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price votes aye. Mr. McHenry? Mr. McHenry votes aye. Mr. Campbell? Mr. Campbell votes no. Mr. McCarthy? Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant votes aye. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee votes aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson votes aye. Mr. Lance? Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
The chairman votes no.
Any other members wish to have their vote recorded? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 15 ayes and 25 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on approving the committee print as amended and forwarding it to the full committee with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed, nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to and forwarded to the full committee with a favorable recommendation. I'm looking. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes in the measure approved by the subcommittee today. If there is no further business to come before the subcommittee is adjourned.